Hi, so I'm going to warn you now that this episode is going to be a downer. We're going to be covering some very serious topics, and I'll be answering some questions which I imagine by now must have been popping into your mind as you've been watching this series. So far, I've told you all about the history of ME, but I've not yet spoken in depth about how this history has affected patients, and that is what we're going to be covering in this episode. We're going to be reflecting upon some of the worst medical abuse the world has ever seen. It's going to be heavy. If you feel like that's going to be a bit too much for you today, you don't have to watch this. You absolutely have my permission to just skip this. It's not going to be an easy watch, and you, the viewer, matter a lot to me, so please look after yourself and put yourself first. But for those of you who are going to stick around, thank you in advance for watching. I'm sorry that I have to tell you about this. I appreciate your attention and your ability to endure the misery of being told this whole awful story. It's shocking and depressing, but it's important nonetheless. After the PACE trial was published, the media's response was gut-wrenchingly disappointing. You would like to think that a medical trial that is so obviously garbage would be rightly criticized, but that didn't happen in mainstream media. Not every journalist has as much integrity and curiosity as David Tuller, unfortunately. Most saw a medical trial published in a reputable journal, made by reputable researchers, and they just didn't question it. What came after was a stream of headline after headline reporting the trial's findings and praising the researchers' efforts. The idea that ME was not a serious disease and that it was psychological in nature spread again like a poison thanks to the PACE trial. We as patients already weren't being taken seriously and our suffering was already being ignored, but the additional damage done by the PACE trial is nigh incomprehensible. I personally like to think of the PACE trial and its aftermath as a giant tsunami. You could say that McEvedy and Beard's 1970 paper was the earthquake that got the ball rolling. Ever since then, the doubt that was cast on the validity of ME as a disease has just snowballed. The metaphorical waves waters swelled along with the growing stigma attached to this illness, and it grew so big that it became overwhelming. It got to the point where, if you looked out over the horizon to try and find some real answers to explain what ME is, all you would end up seeing was this giant, impassable wave and nothing else. And some people established their careers riding off the back of this wave. And there were some other very inspired people who ventured out on boats and tried to brave the tumultuous waters to actually make progress. But how far could they really travel under these circumstances? I think the PACE trial was the moment when the wave finally hit the shore and decades of misogyny and racism and ableism and disbelief of patients spewed out everywhere and wrecked everything. It was the crescendo of these years of spiraling ignorance, a catastrophe for patients, yes, but it was also what finally made the wave break. The PACE trial was such obvious bullshit that it attracted a global backlash. Pairs of eyes from all over the world were suddenly drawn to the wave, and people started to see it for what it really was. It wasn't science, it was discrimination, ableism, and hatred aggressively parading itself as science. That was very abstract, so I'll give you a more concrete description of what came after PACE 2. PACE led to GET and CBT being cemented into the treatment guidelines for ME in countries around the world, the result being that an innumerable number of patients were made to participate in treatments that actually made them worse. And not just a bit worse, a lot worse. The authors of two of the sources I used in my last video both say that GET has permanently damaged their health. They both crashed because of it and they never recovered. On her blog post, Catherine Kane writes, "The exercise physiotherapist started me on 2,500 steps a day and increased it up to 4,000. It may have gone higher, I don't recall. I was extremely damn motivated to get better in the wake of my diagnosis, and so I was the most diligent exerciser ever. I'd be tromping around my backyard in gumboots at 11 p.m., trailed by my utterly mystified dog, getting those last steps in. For 3 months, I did not miss a single day. Before GET, I was fatigued all the time, yes, but I was also working 20 hours a week and running my own business. I was in the zone between mild to moderate. Since GET, I cannot sit at a computer for more than half an hour. I cannot work at any job. I leave the house rarely, usually with support workers. I cannot cook, take public transport, or perform any task without thought and preparation. I am now on the cusp of severe. It is horrifying to think of how many patients have suffered because of these treatments. But although we were hurt, we were also empowered. With the publishing of the PACE trial, patients and charities and support groups finally had something specific to rally around, and a global movement was launched to find out the truth of the trial. In other words, the PACE movement sparked a counter-movement whose aim was to expose GET and CBT as being inconsequential at best and actively harmful at worst. And they did it. It took years of effort from some of the most sick and vulnerable patients in our societies, but they did win out in the end. Through campaigning and re-examining the raw PACE trial data, through correspondence with the authors of the PACE trial and various medical boards, GET and CBT were finally exposed as being unhelpful treatments, and this consequently blew a massive hole in the idea that ME is psychological in nature. In the UK in 2017, NICE established a review group to assess the available research on treatments for ME, and they found that all evidence for GET in the research they reviewed was of low or very low quality. The NICE guidelines for ME treatment were rewritten, which is fantastic, but that change only came about in 2021. GET and CBT were on the UK guidelines for treatment until just 3 years ago. And in Australia, if you can believe it, they are only just now starting the process of getting GET and CBT removed from their guidelines. Need I remind us all that ME was recognized as a neurological disease by the World Health Organization in 1969? We have taken a 55-year detour into psychology when it comes to the treatment of ME. This is abhorrent. And we are only now getting back to square one. The guidelines have been updated, yes, but there is still no approved treatment for us patients. We get no reprieve from our symptoms. The only thing we can do is pace ourselves and pray we don't get any worse, which for an illness more common than MS and AIDS, and which leaves patients with a lower medium health-related quality of life score than lung cancer and heart disease, is completely unacceptable. And the stigma still remains. Between a third and half of GPs in the UK lack confidence in diagnosing or managing ME, or even dispute its existence as a genuine clinical entity. And the people who trained in medicine back in the 80s or earlier would have been trained to adhere to the flavor of biopsychosocial model that claims that ME is all in people's heads. I can't tell you how many times I've had to explain my own disease to medical professionals. In fact, more often than not, I find that people just have no idea what ME is. And also, education about ME is so poor that less than 30% of medical schools in the USA address ME at all. The physical suffering you endure when you have this illness is nightmarish. For some, it's perpetual agony, like suffering in hell. But the mental side of it, I think it would take me months or even years of dedicated writing to even get anywhere close to fully articulating the utter crushing despair that I have experienced because I have this illness. I'll be honest with you, I've almost lost my life to that despair, and now I have mental and physical scars that will never go away because of it. Every ableist comment I've ever received, every problematic headline I've read, every time I've not been believed, it just feels like being stabbed in the stomach. Just a few months after I first got sick, I had a close family member say to my face, "I won't carry your bags for you just because you're pretending to be disabled." One of my partner's family members accused me of fabricating my illness. These people have both apologized for that since, but those words are going to stay with me forever. There have been times where I've been so ill, it genuinely felt like I might die. And in one moment in particular, I remember thinking to myself, well, if I do end up dying, at least I've been able to live these past few years with my partner. But I'm in my mid-20s. It is obscene that I or anyone should face circumstances like these without any treatment or any support from mainstream medicine. I had such a bright future, and so much of it has been taken away by this illness. I can't even begin to tell you how much of a nightmare this has all been, and I cannot stress this enough. I am so lucky. I am one of the best case scenarios for a person with this illness because I'm nowhere near as ill as some of the other patients are. I've been just about able to continue with my education, even though it's been torturous at times. I have a partner who supports me and sticks by me. Financially, I'm managing to get by for now. I'm privileged enough to have received a diagnosis in the first place, and I'm still young enough that I have so much future to look forward to for when there eventually is a treatment made for ME. And most importantly, I'm still alive. I know that in these videos I've added some jokes here and there to capture your attention, but it kind of feels distasteful because people have lost their lives, either because of the illness itself or because of the despair they've been made to face by it. And that heartbreaking topic will be the focus of our next video.